Well, it's Wednesday afternoon. That means it's the time to look at the week in politics. I'm Dave Morris in the Oklahoman's video studio, joined as always via Skype from Chris Castile in Washington. Not in his home office. He's at the Washington Examiner today. How are you, sir?
I'm doing great, Dave. How are you?
Doing quite well. As you see there below the graphics, we'll talk defense bill, we'll talk judges and Medal of Valor here on this Wednesday, May 18th. And really the Supreme Court, the fact that it has 8 judges ties into a lot of what we talk about today, including the Supreme Court punting back the latest religious liberty challenge to Obamacare back to the lower courts. What's going on there, Chris?
Right, this was the case, it's kind of the follow-on case to Hobby Lobby a couple of years ago, and that was the case, the Oklahoma City Arts and Crafts chain won, basically saying that it's against our religion to offer these types of contraceptives, and they were a for-profit company, and the Supreme Court narrowly agreed with them. In this case, was about 24 plaintiffs, all of them nonprofit religious organizations, including 4 Christian colleges in Oklahoma and the Little Sisters of the Poor charity in Denver, and they're nonprofits who also didn't want to be involved in any way, really, is how to put it, with offering contraceptive coverage to their employees. And they didn't really have to offer it, but they basically had to notify either their insurance company or the administration that they were opting out. They objected even to that. And so that case made it all the way through the lower courts, the district courts, and then the federal appeals courts. The Supreme Court accepted a bunch of cases and consolidated them into one case. We're just going to decide this issue. And then Justice Scalia died in February. So they were going to probably deadlock on this case. They held oral arguments in March, and it just looked like the 4 conservatives were going to vote with the charities, and the 4 liberals were going to say, hey, this isn't that big of a burden on you to say that you don't want to provide the coverage. So you had a situation where, with the vacancy, it looked like it was not going to get resolved, and that would have created kind of a mess, because most of the circuit courts, most of the appeals courts actually sided with the Obama administration. The plaintiffs in this case did not, hardly won a single one. And, most of the judges and appeals courts thought it's not really a burden on your religion to sign this form. So if the court had deadlocked 4-4, all of those appeals court decisions would have been, they would have reverted back to them, which means that they would have had to have abided by what the administration wanted them to do. And what they did on Monday was just send it back unanimously, and essentially, skipping all the legal jargon and some of the steps in between, they basically said, work this out, which is really, maybe that was kind of what should have happened in the first place with this. Maybe there should have been, rather than going all the way, costing all this money, all this time to work on this, challenge this very discrete issue about an opt-out form, whether the administration and these charities could have just worked this thing out. And, that's kind of the case. That's been the case, and not just under Obama, but certainly it seems so often with the administration. These conservative groups, challenge his, whatever his administration does on, EPA stuff or healthcare stuff almost immediately, works its way up through the courts, and then you have to get the Supreme Court to weigh in on the darn thing, rather than just the process working like it probably should, which is at the legislative level, some kind of negotiations that go on, so you don't have to get some sweeping legal opinion about every little regulation that comes out of this administration. But that's the way it's been. But it's just not going to, with this vacancy, they're just going to continue to deadlock. And the court, I think, is almost, with the lack of cases that they've taken, and kind of the way that they've had deadlocked on a few, you feel like that they're just going to kind of pull back for a while, not have these sweeping decisions like we've had in the last few years on all kinds of things, from same-sex marriage and Hobby Lobby to death penalty and everything, and just try to wait until this vacancy situation sorts itself out, which is going to be a year.
I was about to say, Chris, talk about that a little bit. What are we looking at timeline-wise on filling Scalia's position?
Well, it's a process, right? And if the Republicans aren't going to move on this process this year, and I'm convinced they're not, then you have the next president sworn in January 20th. Well, maybe they start vetting somebody, maybe they've got a short list in mind, whatever. But that's an incredibly involved process to get a Supreme Court justice through vetting and the hearings, and then confirmation, and then on to the court. And you don't know where this judge will have come from anyway. Whether he comes from justice or he's not, or an appeals court. But there also might be cases, as there have been with Elena Kagan and the last few justices, they have to recuse themselves anyway because maybe they were involved in this case before. But long story short, the whole next term, which begins in October of this year, is going to be like the last few months of this one. It's basically going to be, they can't really take on huge constitutional questions or anything where, it looks like that it's going to be a 4-4 split. What's the point in doing that? So I think that the court is basically going to just kind of back off for a while until this vacancy situation sorts itself out. And I would say it's, late March, early April at the earliest. By then, in 2017, that term is almost over with.
Perhaps they'll catch some Nationals baseball action this summer. They'll have more time. We're chatting via Skype with Chris Castile in Washington, D.C. And Chris, you reported the Senate is also slow-walking lower court judges. There are 2 for Oklahoma City that are awaiting action in the Senate now.
Right, and they were probably going to get out of the Judiciary Committee tomorrow. The committee, I expect, will vote Thursday morning to advance Suzanne Mitchell and Scott Polk to the full Senate floor. They've been nominated for 2 vacancies in the Oklahoma City. What's the judicial district that's based in Oklahoma City? It covers all of Western Oklahoma. Every federal case filed in Western Oklahoma gets filed in Oklahoma City, and there's 2 vacancies there. And I think both of these vacancies have existed for more than a year now, and there was some kind of slow walking on both parts. But you wound up with 2 nominees last summer, I think it was in August, that James Lankford and Jim Inhofe, the 2 Republican senators, agreed on and told the Obama administration. And then it took the White House 4 months to get them, formally nominated and over to the Senate, which is a long time. And they, probably bear some responsibility if Suzanne Mitchell and Scott Polk aren't confirmed this year. I think the White House being so slow. But to get back to the Senate slow walking, and in a presidential election year, it happens every presidential election year for probably the past 40 years. The party that is not in power in the White House, in this case the Republicans, will slow down all the judicial nominations at a certain point in that election year, hoping their party will win the White House and they can replace all the nominations that were made by the other party with their own. So, we've obviously seen that this year with the Supreme Court nominee Merrick Garland, but it happens with the appeals court judges at some point, and even the very lowest court judges, the district court judges, the first judges to hear cases in federal court. And that's what we've got going on right now. And so last week I went to the Judiciary Committee, and our 2 nominees were on the list. And it's customary, really, that they're held over the first time. Hardly any judge ever gets, advanced after. But the Democrats started pounding the Republican chairman of the committee. Why even vote any more judges out of this committee if we're not going to vote for them on the Senate floor? If you're just doing this, to keep the process moving into a dead end, why keep these people hanging? Just tell them you're not going to get confirmed. And the chairman, Chuck Grassley of Iowa, said, look, I've been told there will be more confirmations. I just have to check with, the Senate Majority Leader. That's Mitch McConnell of Kentucky. So they're going to get out, they'll get out and they'll be on what's called the calendar, on the Senate calendar, and we'll just find out. I would say this, and I think everybody accepts this up here. Lankford, Inhofe, pretty much anybody in the Senate talking about this judicial confirmation situation. If they don't get confirmed by July, when the parties leave to go to their national conventions, that's not going to happen this year. They're not going to come back after Labor Day and confirm any judges. They've got to get confirmed by July, or it's over with. There will be no more judges confirmed after in the summer.
Interesting stuff. All right, enough with judges. We're chatting via Skype with Chris Castile in Washington, D.C. And Chris, you had a story yesterday about the split that's emerged between the House and the Senate Republicans about whether women should have to register for the draft beginning in 2018. Congressman Tom Cole out of Moore is among the Republicans who decided to not let the House vote on women registering for the draft. It's taken out of the House defense bill. Explain that to me, and is there still a chance that women would have to start registering for the draft in 2018?
I think there's a good chance that women will have to start registering for the draft in 2018. And the reason is because the Senate Republicans are almost the opposite. I mean, they seem to feel very strongly that women should have to register for the draft. And the reason this has kind of emerged in the last couple of years is because of the push in the military, by the Obama administration onto the military, that women engage in more combat, in every combat role, that every combat role be available to women that can qualify for, whether you're, if you have to go through some kind of like ranger test or see it, whatever it might be, they are eligible now to go into these combat units that they weren't eligible to go into before. So the feeling among a lot of people is, well, look, there's nothing that women can't do in the military anymore. So they should have to register for the draft. As we know, there is no draft. There may not ever be a draft again. Who knows? It's impossible to say.
In fact, as you had in your story, that's Representative Tom Cole's points. They're not going to be a draft.
So, but that's his point, and you could probably take that either way, right? So if there's not going to be a draft, if it is just symbolic, then why keep them from registering? I think, like I said, I think you could argue that round or flat. So it actually came out of the House Armed Services Committee in the defense bill, their defense bill, very narrowly, that women would have to register. And there's an influential committee called the Rules Committee that Tom Cole sits on. And I should mention, too, that Tom Cole has Fort Sill, which is a huge Army base in southwestern Oklahoma, and Tinker Air Force Base in his district. He's very familiar with military issues, very familiar with military people. And he sits on a committee that gets a bill ready, kind of the final prep to go to the full floor of the House for debate. And they took it out, that committee, the influential Rules Committee, took out that provision and basically set it up so you can't even vote on it. We're not even going to debate this in the House. Meanwhile, on the Senate Armed Services Committee, on which Jim Inhofe sits, a Republican of Oklahoma, they had it in their defense bill. And I should say, too, just as a quick aside, these are very important bills, these defense bills. For all the talk, and it's mostly correct, that Congress doesn't do that much anymore, they still work on defense bills because they're so important. They set defense policy for the next year. It's all about weapon systems, personnel, all kinds of important things that, having to do with the military and our policies. The defense bill, the Senate defense bill, had a provision in there that they would have to start registering. Mike Lee, a Republican of Utah, made a motion to take it out. They had a vote. It was 19-7 to keep it in. And the Republicans control this committee. So it was a very lopsided vote by Republicans to keep that provision in. And among those voting to keep it in were 3 Republican women that sit on that committee. Kelly Ayotte, Joni Ernst, who is an Army veteran. It was actually a commander in Iraq. And I'm blanking on the third woman who's on there. But anyway, there were 3 Republican women, all of whom voted to keep the registration requirement in there, and John McCain, who's the chairman of the committee. So it's, given everything that's in that defense bill, and very important things that are in that defense bill, it's probably not on the on that list. But it's gotten a lot of attention. It's kind of, I guess, another one of those symbolic political issues that don't have much meaning, kind of beyond the debate of it.
Just part of the coverage Chris Castile provides every week. And in fact, in that story, you noted all 7 women on the Senate Armed Services Committee, all 7 women, including those 3 Republicans, voted to require women to register for the draft. That's interesting stuff.
Right. 4 of them were Democrats and 3 Republicans.
Anything else you're working on, Chris? Perhaps a follow-up on the hard-hitting Trump-Megyn Kelly interview from last night.
Oh, no.
No.
No, haven't had a chance to watch that yet. But I am following the defense bill today in the House, and tomorrow I'm following the Judiciary Committee that we talked about.
Very good. More coverage from Chris Castile, of course, can be found in the Oklahoman and online at newsok.com. Chris, I joked about the Nationals, but that was quite a pitching performance we have seen out of them recently.
Yeah, and quite a duel last night against the Mets, and unfortunately we came up on the wrong end of it. But yeah, the 20 strikeout game by
Right.
Max Scherzer last week was thrilling to watch. Almost as thrilling as the Thunder game, but not quite.
Thunder Warriors coming up tonight. Chris, as always, we appreciate your time.
All right, thanks, Dave.
All right, have a good one. More coverage from Chris in the Oklahoman and on newsok.com.